talking about here is value capture across the entire AI stack. So we're talking a lot about infrastructure today, but there are other elements of the stack in which, for all of you founders and entrepreneurs out there, in fact, quick show of hands, how many of you in the audience would consider yourself founders or entrepreneurs? Okay, all right, yeah, we got a couple there. How many of you out in the audience are VCs or investors? A couple of the same hands that I'm seeing. Okay, so then this talk is going to be very, very relevant because we're going to be talking about where some of these early stage investors see value and do not see value in different parts of the stack, from infrastructure all the way up to the application layer. But before we get into that, do you
want to do intros?
Chris? Yeah, let's do some intros.
Rock and roll. Hey everybody, thanks for having us. My name is Avichal. I'm one of the founders at Electric Capital. My background's mostly as an entrepreneur. Started and sold 2 companies. I have a background in machine learning. That's what I studied at Stanford, and then worked at Google for a little bit. I worked on search ranking and ads ranking. And so it's fun to see a bunch of this stuff come back and be hot again. And then as an investor, I sort of fell into it as an angel investor and was fortunate to be involved with a bunch of companies that have gone on to be worth a lot of money over the years across a couple of different waves. So a bunch of up the middle stuff like Notion, Figma, Airtable, and a lot of frontier tech things over the years, like Cruise, which does self-driving cars, or Boom, which does supersonic airplanes, or a bunch of AI companies and crypto. I spend a lot of my day job on crypto these days because there's a lot of quirks there that let us have a really great business and a scaled fund, but still do a bunch of investing on the AI and frontier tech side. So excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yep. Hey, everybody. My name's Chris McCann, one of the GPs of Race Capital, a venture fund based in Palo Alto. We do all early stage investing, primarily pre-seed and seed, typically lead a lot of our investments, mostly within infrastructure and the enterprise. So we're early seed investors in Databricks, Somatic, Opaque, Vectera, Zeet, also on the crypto side, Solana, Lightning Labs, a bunch of other companies. Before this, I spent 6 years at Greylock Partners, mostly worked with Reid Hoffman, John Lilly back then, and was most involved with Figma, Discord, and Coinbase, all in their Series A timeframe.
And just to make it fun, I've started doing this new thing, if anybody was around in the last week at conferences. I just disagree with whoever is up here. And so whatever Chris says, I'm just going to say the opposite and try to make a case for it. A, because I think it's much more interesting to try to figure out like what's actually real, if you can make a credible case for the other side of it. But it's also more fun for us, because it's just no fun if...
You also make it a challenge for me now.
Totally, yeah, it's a lot more fun. So I'm going to try to make an intellectually honest case for the opposite of whatever Chris believes.
Honestly, the hot takes and contrarian positions are really half the fun of doing these panels anyway. So then let's start off with an easy one.
Oh, which, by the way, don't listen to anything I say. None of this is financial advice. Don't make any decisions based on anything I say. Basically, don't listen to anything I have to say.
Whatever he said.
Yeah. On that we'll agree.
On that note, fully disclosed. All right, and for myself, as I mentioned, Ryan Cunningham, Senior Associate Builder at AI Fund, which is a venture studio down in Palo Alto, where we incubate and build AI companies and ship them at the pre-seed stage. Now, I want to start with the topic that was leading into, or through lunch and then now here, which, Chris, you've coined before as the commoditization of the cloud. So in other words, for this vision of a democratized cloud, as you put it, in more specific terms, you've mentioned how you're looking for companies that are trying to have multi-cloud cross-compatibility with minimal switching costs. And there are some themes within there that seem to be at odds with each other. But can you talk a little bit more about what your vision for this democratized cloud actually looks like?
Yeah, so right now, how it currently stands today, there's a few incumbent cloud players, AWS, Azure, GCP, et cetera. And once you get hooked up into their systems and build your applications, you're effectively locked up in their ecosystem. The data egress cost alone to kind of move or switch clouds is extremely high. So we've invested in a handful of companies, namely Zeet, that kind of make it really easy to deploy, kind of cross clouds, or to do computations kind of across these different things. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the compute, GPU, or sort of even CPU, is effectively being underutilized, or sometimes not even utilized at all, which is effectively a huge waste on the ecosystem. And so we think there needs to be much more efficient mechanisms where entrepreneurs could actually build and deploy sort of anywhere collectively across any underlying hardware, and they don't need to worry about which ecosystem they're a part of. Right now, I think there's such a huge emphasis on it now because of all the GPU shortages that we see, but this is a much, much, much bigger underlying problem. We do a lot of work also with UC Berkeley. in their lab. They have one specific lab called the Sky Lab, which their whole life mission and their whole goals kind of also centered around this. So we've been kind of supporting this thesis for a long time now.
Do I get to disagree now?
You're welcome to if you want.
Awesome. So I think the real challenge of why it's so hard to democratize the cloud is actually that it doesn't have much to do with the functionality or the utility or the utilization or all these things that engineers like to think about. It has to do with business and regulatory constraints, which is like most businesses can't deal with complexity. And so things get packaged up in such a way that the purchaser of these, the purchase maker, the purchase decision maker doesn't have to think about that complexity. And that's really what's happening. And that's why AWS and Azure and Google will continue to just crush everybody. And those other markets will sort of say niche. The other thing I think to think about in the AI specific context that is sort of a little bit of learning from the crypto side is I think the government has gotten much smarter about these things in the last 5 to 10 years, just the same way the incumbents have gotten a lot smarter about adopting technology. And you actually just saw this, I think, this week with the US government saying that you can't resell certain kinds of GPUs to Gulf states because they realize that what's going to happen is those GPUs will make their way to China. Or you saw this with 5G. You're seeing this with sort of TSMC. The government has realized that these are actually national security assets, like the ability to have GPUs, the ability to have compute, and so on. And it's going to turn out that the way to really have choke points for the government to be able to regulate this stuff properly is going to be to choke them into 3 to 5 really big players. So they're going to kingmake the same way that they do with the banks, because that actually allows them to have choke points. Because like regulating, LLMs that anybody can run and get to scale and that any business can use, very hard. Regulating 3 companies and calling the CEOs of those companies into your office to say, hey, you're a de facto monopoly now. You get to print money the way JP Morgan almost literally gets to print money with the Fed. And in order for you to continue to have that business, you need to do what we say. And I would not be surprised if basically the cloud providers end up drifting in that direction. And actually, they have an incentive to do that. So they're going to lobby to make that happen, actually, to shut everybody else out. Which you kind of see some of the AI companies doing now. It's like if you've hit escape velocity, you kind of want to say like, hey, AI is really dangerous. Like, don't let this get out of whack. Please, regulate this. Please regulate us, because really what you're doing is creating a regulatory moat. And so I suspect the same thing happens around kind of compute at the compute layer.
So there's 2 themes that are wrapped up in that answer, which, Chris, you're welcome to respond to either one of them. The first is the applicability of a distributed cloud to enterprise use cases. And within enterprise, we can fraction that further to say there are startups and smaller companies that maybe have fewer security and privacy restrictions over where their data and models are actually stored, whether it's SOC 2, HIPAA compliant, that sort of thing. That's one domain. And then large enterprises, which definitely have those requirements, which is where things like Azure Private Cloud come into play. The other is, regulatory concerns, physical controls, physical access to high quality compute, and the fact that there are already mesh nets of lower end GPUs that are in use in states like China and Russia that cannot get access to A100s or H100s in the first place. Which one of those do you want to tackle?
Yeah, maybe let me, take a little bit in combination, is you're already somewhat seeing the fractionalizing of the 3 main players already today. I'd say providers like sort of CoreWeave and others are already showing there's such an insatiable demand that you're going to go outside of the big 3 to begin with, despite sort of the regulatory or sort of access control themes. And then on top of that, if you think a little bit further, a lot of the inference side is sometimes even just hitting a straight up API. So they're not even managing sort of the compute on-prem anymore, if you will. We've already kind of gone past that. And so I think if we're sort of in that world already, we're going to have to basically create platforms to kind of sort of map onto the compute infrastructure that people are demanding for today. And we're going to have to sort of figure out all of the sort of access control and regulatory and compliance and audit and that sort of stuff within a decentralized environment. I don't think a decentralized environment necessarily gets rid of any of those. It makes it harder, but I don't think that's necessarily a blocker per se.
Within, when we talk about distributed cloud or multi-cloud, I want us to try to be maybe a little bit more precise actually in the language, because there's 2 different concepts that we could actually tackle and indicate a preference for. So there are startups that exist today, like Vantage from A16Z, they got their Series A, I think recently, where they have a feature called autopilot that allows you to actually manage, or they would manage the arbitrage between the amount that you would pay effectively for a spot instance, but normally you would have unreliability associated with that, but get the reliability of an on-demand reserved instance of high-quality compute. And they'll place it with some arbitrage on the back end, take a cut off the top, but effectively give you more reliable compute for less. That's one way to do it. The other way is this hard lean into reliability that a lot of our speakers today have been talking about with just purely distributed infrastructure. The mesh nets of perhaps lower quality GPUs that in aggregate will mirror some fraction or even just at par with the high quality compute infrastructure. Do you see there being a role for both one or the other in different use cases?
I guess we've seen use cases and usages in both. I think the second one, the far more decentralized nature, is far more disruptive in nature. Much more harder to get off the ground, much more harder to bootstrap, much more harder to get demand. But like if you could really build this out as a sort of first-party system, that could be a sort of huge company in and of itself. That being said, we actually see a fair amount of things on like the first kind of optimization case as well. There was a company we looked at. We didn't invest. I won't say the company's name out of privacy reasons, but they were even optimizing AW usage within region. So you can move from east to west or international to take up spot instances for the exact hardware configuration that you need. Even staying within one cloud, they actually saw a lot of efficiency within that.
And was that efficiency in terms of cost advantage
Cost.
or reliable? Okay, so there was enough arbitrage between just single country regional clouds that was actually incredibly useful.
Yeah, which we're actually surprising how much sort of cost savings there was, even just by opening up your horizon within a single cloud provider. Because again, I think there's a sort of Vantage also plays into this too as well. A lot of the consoles by AWS and kind of others, they're very complicated to actually go through. They make them very cumbersome to do everything. So even making that more efficient within your sort of own environment, I think there's a lot of meat in there to discover too.
Avichal, your response?
Well, two thoughts. So just to bring it to this theme of value capture, right? So one is almost certainly both of these things will coexist, like the decentralized, decentralized, and it's a spectrum, or like small hardware providers all the way to AWS. The question I think since this audience is mostly founders, it look like, and more technical, the question is, what is the relative value capture in those different parts of the market, and how durable is that value capture over an extended period of time? And what you tend to see in a lot of early markets is that you see a high degree of fragmentation, and then you see sort of aggregation and consolidation over time. And so you just want to be really smart as a founder. Like I suspect right now there are going to be a lot of companies like the AWS optimization company or Vantage, or people trying to do, how do you do an Airbnb for GPUs, or whatever else, right? Like have your pick. The question really, I think, both from the founder side and our side is, well, which of those things is durable? What is actually a defensible business for 10 years and why? And I think with a lot of this stuff, it's been quite challenging for the more decentralized stuff to be more durable from a business perspective, because usually what you're trading off is efficiency and resiliency. Like decentralized systems tend to be much more resilient. And so I think there will certainly be those use cases, but I think the value capture, to bring it back to the topic for the panel, I worry that the value capture is mostly in the centralized systems. And so you just have to be really aware of that. Like you kind of see this manifesting in the SaaS ecosystem right now, where for a long time you had highly fragmented point solutions in SaaS. And as a company, you could get 6 or 8 or 10 or 15 SaaS subscriptions. And now you're looking around and you're like, oh my gosh, as a startup, like why do I have like 36 monthly SaaS subscriptions? This is bananas. And so people are going to start to consolidate, especially in a down cycle. And I think the same thing will happen basically to the entire AI stack. Like I think we're going to start with a bunch of point solutions, and then they're going to start to consolidate and aggregate, and then you'll get really big winners. And the question I would be asking if I were in your seat is, which of those point solutions that starts off is the right place to start to end up doing the aggregation, so that you can roll up everybody else? Or how do you finance the business that you're starting to be able to sell into one of those? And be smart about that, right? Like not everything needs to be a $100 billion company. If you start a company, bootstrap it, don't raise that much money, and it's worth 250, and you sell it, it's life-changing money for you and everybody at the company. But that's kind of where I spend a lot of time, is like, how does the market landscape play out, and what are the feedback loops that allow certain companies to end up having leverage over other companies to consolidate? Because almost certainly we're in this highly fragmented early period right now, which is going to result in a lot of aggregation and consolidation over the next 10 years, and you just want to be really well positioned for that as a founder. Otherwise, you're just going to end up raising a lot more capital than you are able to do anything with, and then, you know, the only people that end up making money are the investors, which is just not good for you.
I like that. Trying to be incredibly specific about exactly who the customer profile is that you're going to be going after. We talk about efficiency, we talk about resiliency, we talk about those trade-offs. It's not going to be the one place that every single customer is going to want to go to. And it can be easy to get fascinated with the kind of technology that you're building and the capabilities of that. But it can also be just as easy to get lost in the sparkle of that novel technology and forget how you really need to be building for a specific kind of customer at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is probably, if you walk out of here having learned only one thing, I would basically implore everybody in this audience to think about this one thing, which is technologists in particular have this desire to want to solve hard technology problems. And they believe that if you solve hard technology problems, that you will actually capture more value. And that's not the way the world works. That's sort of the way engineers wish the world worked. And the reality is that there are market structures and constraints on markets, things like regulation or regulatory or weirdness in human behavior, that lead to inferior technologies winning. And really thinking about what that is and what those market structures are and how those things will aggregate in this particular market is really important. Obviously, if this were a room full of MBAs, I would say the exact opposite. I'd be like, please just go build some technology and talk to some users and like solve a real problem. Don't like show me a spreadsheet. In this particular audience, that's what I would be really thinking about, is that actually like almost certainly the problem that you're solving is a problem. Almost certainly your technology is better, and almost certainly that does not matter.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into the sort of enterprise side a little bit, but to sort of Avichal's point, I think sometimes technical founders in particular, they usually lose a little bit of sort of forest for the clouds, if you will.
That was good.
When you're selling to enterprise, they usually only give a shit about one or two things.
Yeah.
Are you making me money, or are you saving me more money, and how much? If it's 1 or 2 or 3%, they don't care. If it's 50% plus, they care a lot. If you're bringing me new leads and new customers that I can convert into revenue, I care a lot. I'm very motivated. And so you have to take whatever you're building and morph it into something that they care about, and make sure you're targeting the right person, the right customer, not some low-level individual engineer, but the right person on the right team. A lot of this go-to-market sort of action might not have mattered so much a few years ago, but matters a lot now, especially in the down cycle.
Super critical, yeah. Put another way to the topic of the conversation, like value creation and value capture are two very different things.
So that's actually a perfect transition into one of the other topics that I wanted us to get into, which is the evolution of AI from the lab into the enterprise. And we're in this point now where at AI Fund, for a lot of our startups, about a year and a half ago, the sales calls were very, very different in terms of trying to talk to enterprises about how the algorithms or the platform that we had developed could help them, save X amount of money, or we get them much more revenue. The topic, the concept was just so alien to them that it would be very hard to broach those conversations unless they already knew what they wanted, which is another point. But after November, December of last year, Davos, everyone is talking about ChatGPT. All of a sudden, every enterprise thinks that they need to have their own large language model, regardless of whether or not that's true. So we're in this point now where everyone is all of a sudden aware of the technology and wants it to some degree. However, we're also in a position where incumbents are not really taking this lying down, and there may be a lot of inherent advantages that they have to bring to the fore in actually launching AI-enabled features that otherwise may have been perfectly fine individual startups on their own in past cycles when that was ignored. So how are you guys seeing this evolution from the lab to the enterprise and the war, the conflict that's taking place between small startups and the Goliaths that have more resources?
Yeah, I know we're talking a little bit about this backstage as well. I think we're in a really weird moment right now. We're post kind of Davos, if you will. Every company in the world, every individual, every person wants an AI story. And so there's an insatiable demand for anything. I don't care. And so if you're an AI company, a feature, a corporation, whatever, it doesn't matter. I want it. I'll pay for it. I'll put it on my credit card. And you're seeing a lot of traction and adoption. But a lot of this stuff is very fragile. A lot of this is very non-recurrent. And so what's going to matter is what of this stuff is durable in nature for the long term. What actually changes workflows, makes you more money. Like, I think to some extent we kind of have to go back to fundamentals because this cycle will pass at some point in time. We're in it, so it's kind of hard to take our heads out of it. But I think now is also a really weird time where a startup actually does have a shot against the Microsoft. You might not have had that a few years ago, but right now in this moment, you do have a chance because large enterprises are willing to try something new. A lot of people might not realize, but to get a big company to actually try a startup's products, actually pretty hard. The fact that companies are actually able to get some usage, some POC, some trials is actually a pretty big effort. So if you have that, take advantage of it. Build as much as possible, get into that, prove as much valuable, because now is the moment of time if you have any. Because usually we tend to the incumbents, but I think now is kind of the period where this might not be the case.
So I have to take the other side?
Your
Okay.
take?
Yeah, I would say if you look at prior cycles of technology waves, in the early part where the Davos people get excited and then a bunch of enterprises get excited, usually what they're doing is they're throwing test budget at it. So there's like some innovation group or there's like some small team that like reports into the chief information officer at some legacy business, and they're gonna try a thing. And then the startups get really excited because they got some budget, but it's not actually real. And probably in like 18 months, a bunch of this budget will turn over because everybody will realize that it doesn't actually, 90% of it has no business impact, and so it'll all get cut as all the businesses realize this. So everybody's revenue will fall off a cliff at the startup side. And so the incumbents actually have two really big advantages. One is that the new revenue is a small percentage of their existing revenue. So if you're Microsoft and you launch a bunch of new AI tooling that a bunch of people want to use, it just doesn't matter relative to your existing business. That's actually an advantage when you're talking about hype cycles, because that means they can just keep investing in it if they feel like it. If Satya says, we're just going to keep doing this, then they'll keep doing it. It doesn't matter that it's $100 million of revenue that went to 50, but if you're a startup, that's your entire business. And so actually incumbents have this like really nice structural advantage. Two is, one thing I'd be very worried about if I were a startup today, and thinking about is I think the incumbents are executing better than they ever have. Like, this is not the year 2000
True.
and the internet where the incumbents are caught flat-footed and they're like, what's the internet? I don't know. Like, I don't know how to use email. No, like, you are competing against Mark Zuckerberg. You are competing against Satya. Like, these people are like technology native. They know how to use technology. They're like in the guts of this. They know how to write code. And they're willing to use every advantage that they have to crush you. Just take a look at Slack versus Microsoft Teams. Right? Like, this is a very different era of computing and computation and startups versus incumbents than has ever existed before. This is not 2005, where you can just be disruptive because you're a startup. And so I think it's going to be quite challenging for most startups. Like, I think most startup people, kind of back to this idea of like the best technology wins kind of mindset, like distribution is so, like, an inferior product with better distribution can often win, and that's actually what the incumbents have. And they often actually have a structural advantage in having more data and having all those existing relationships and being able to bolt on more revenue. So I would think really hard about where is it that the incumbents don't have an advantage and why is that? Because you as a startup really only have speed as an advantage and maybe lack of brand as an advantage, or the ability to pursue new verticals that the incumbents can't pursue for some reason as an advantage. But that's actually relatively narrow, like in terms of the places where this stuff can really work relative to the incumbents and actually have durable value.
With respect to distribution, there is another strategy that I've seen a lot of startups try to pursue is leveraging open source as one way to try to bottoms up make up for the lack of distribution that they may otherwise have if they on the other side as an enterprise. But it can be difficult to navigate the transition from going from a beloved open source product into then actually saying we're now a business at the end of the day. How are we going to actually turn this into a competitive product which actually makes money? And there's a great deal of open source enthusiasm out here in the audience right now, and even within some of your portfolio companies. How do you advise entrepreneurs that want to lean into open source as an advantage against incumbents, but need to protect against the likelihood of perhaps giving away too much?
Do you want me to go first? You always get, I don't want to keep making you go first, put you on the spot. Okay.
I'll disagree with you now.
I must. So I think most projects that are open source will capture very little value. This goes back to this idea of like value creation versus value capture are two different things. And actually historically, if you look at it, it's like, well, who captured all of the value from all the amazing open source, Nix technology, GNU, Star Unix, Linux, all this stuff? Who actually captured all the value? It was like, Azure and AWS for running all this infrastructure, and like, Facebook for taking it and packaging it up into the killer app and so on, right? Android, your MacBook, like the people who packaged it up into a product end to end, sitting on top of the open source stuff, are actually who won. So you can use open source, I think, as a distribution advantage to build a brand and build trust, and then say, hey, I'm the expert at this particular kind of technology, and therefore you should use my stuff. But I would look very carefully at whether or not that brand and trust ultimately translates into more revenue for you. And I would seek out examples where that's actually true. And usually it is true in one of two cases. One is if you own the end user experience directly. So you're actually, like the open source stack is a means to an end, and what you're really doing is building an end consumer product. You could consider Apple as an example of this, built on actually a bunch of open source tech, or Facebook or Google. Or the other extreme, which is the really CapEx heavy stuff, where you're literally going to run infrastructure for people, because the infrastructure is non-replaceable. And so this is like AWS. And so if you have some tooling that ultimately requires you to run the infrastructure, and somebody's going to pay you to run the infrastructure, and you get to take 25% margins on that, that might work because you're the expert at running your tooling on this infrastructure. But I think a lot of the middleware stuff in the middle is actually just going to get squeezed big time. It might be a really good business in the short term, and then as either the people who own the end user relationship or the people who own the infrastructure start to sort of get to scale, they're just going to commoditize you. They're just going to start giving away what you have for free in order to eat all your customers, because they're the ones who make all the money anyway.
We actually invest quite a lot within open source. So maybe let me share like a few sort of referential examples. So one, open source tends to work well when the people who adopt open source are going to be the end customers for the commercial product that you come out with. They're one and the same. So this is effectively a distribution hack to get a bunch of people excited about you in the door, that you could upsell them into a cloud-hosted version, or one with SSO, whatever the SaaSified features that you're selling into. Secondly, there's a danger of the opposite version of this, where the users of the open source version are not the end customers of what you're doing. So you build all this community and all this stuff and all this end developer love, but if your users are going to be marketers, then none of this stuff really matters. Again, for the enterprise, they don't care about open source. They care about, do you make me more money or save me more money or efficiency or new workflow or something. Open source alone isn't enough. And then the third category is one where you're building some sort of platform where other developers are building tools on top of your stuff, aka kind of the middleware type thing. This works in the instance where these applications actually get used at scale from enterprise on upwards, and you could develop runtime or something that sort of captures the compute of this. But again, if these applications are all just cool demo type stuff, but to actually build a sort of durable application, you just use ServiceNow stuff, then that doesn't really work either. So I would just be careful of open source should be like, unless you're doing it for just open source sake, that's kind of a different one, that's cool. But if you're trying to do it for like a sort of company strategy, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons and not just because open source. Like it has to be a means to an end to something.
Yeah, I agree with that. One thought here too is kind of goes back to this idea of value capture. And I think one thing to think about as an entrepreneur is that the amount of value that your company will capture is not some sort of monotonically increasing line, right? It's that, like, hype cycles sort of play into it, right? You might actually be able to capture a lot of value in 2 years with very little capital raised if you exit at the right time, and then you could grind for another 6 years and your company is worth exactly the same amount of money. Right, and so you want to be really smart about this too. And so I think we are at this moment in time actually where I think if you assemble the right team, if you open source it because you get a bunch of distribution, it could be extremely strategic to somebody who would want to give it away for free, and they'll have incremental revenue coming into their business. And so you want to think sort of systemically too, right? Like you could actually, there are probably some really important building blocks that are going to be really hard for some people to build. And if you have the technical depth on those particular areas and you get a bunch of open source distribution, what you've done is built brand and trust in a key customer set that maybe Amazon or Microsoft or OpenAI or somebody needs to buy. And you can actually capture a lot of value that way too. So one thing to think about is like aligning your value capture with the market cycle and being smart about that, and aligning your value capture with the other businesses in the space and being really smart about that. Like we did this at my second startup where it was sort of in the mobile boom, and we realized that some key pieces of crawling infrastructure were just going to be really necessary for Pinterest, Twitter, Google, Facebook, Dropbox. Like everybody would kind of need that. And it was actually technically challenging to build. And so if you're the first to be able to get to that landmark, all of a sudden you'll have 4 or 5 or 6 people bidding on you, and you can actually capture a lot of value in a relatively short period of time. So you also, I think, want to be smart about your strategy for your startup, right? There are totally viable exit paths if you're smart about it in this sort of an industry, where you can get aggregated into a bigger company and have a fantastic return for yourself and your employees.
Look at that. You guys are actually agreeing on something to end the panel. I am getting the hook. Do we have time for questions, or are we out? Okay, so we're going to open it up for one question from the audience, since we are running a little bit over. No pressure, of course.
No questions.
No questions about
Oh, there's a question. There we go.
about 4th or 5th row from the front.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Alex from Berkeley, and I had a question for Chris about like the open cloud, I guess. Like, what do you see as the missing element when we have things like Kubernetes and Terraform and sort of all these things to make our applications portable? Like, what's missing from our current tech stack that we need to make?
It's a great question. Again, I'm trying to harken back to, I guess, a couple of examples of things that we're seeing right now. I guess one, so there's the, to the broader viewpoint, there's the abstract, decentralized cloud, multiple computer, there's the dream, if you will, and there's the reality. And we see a lot of companies, I guess, trying to build and sell the dream, but the dream of that's going to take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to build out, and it's a very abstract concept that might or might not work. I think some of the better examples we see is people that try to make this more of a reality today, maybe in a particularly smaller domain. So take a sort of machine learning job or training job and be able to just distribute that across any cloud, maybe take the first big 3 ones to pick with right now, capture some market share to then build out kind of the rest of it later. I think people need to take the more component pieces and focus it on something very specific, where they can solve some endpoint problem within the enterprise and build upwards from there. The pieces are there, the soup's there, but nobody's packaged it up and given it to the sort of enterprise in a format that they can digest.
I'll give you a concrete example. Another way to say that, which I agree with, is like pick your user and your use case and then work from there, rather than starting with like your technology components and working forward. So I was at a conference, it was really interesting. It was a bunch of regulatory people, a bunch of government people, because I do a bunch of that stuff on the crypto side. There was a senior official from the government of Bahrain there, and they were talking about how they're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on GPUs and infrastructure. There were some other Gulf state leaders there, and they all sort of were nodding. And I was like, wow, that's pretty fascinating. You're just not going to go to AWS? You're not going to go to OpenAI? Like, what's the deal? And the short version of why is they basically said, look, it isn't my words, not theirs. They're sort of much more diplomatic about it because they were literally diplomats. And they said, you know what, we basically don't trust a bunch of tech bros in San Francisco to be values aligned with us. And so we have to train our own models, which totally makes sense if you think about it, right? If you're a foreign country, you're like, do you really want LLMs that are trained on American propaganda? Like, probably not. And so all of a sudden it becomes very quickly obvious that actually like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Singapore, even like the EU states, like why wouldn't Finland train its own models, right? Like they have a very clear history with Russia, like, you know, who knows who's training the underlying model, right? So all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, this is actually an interesting use case. Like these people are gonna spend hundreds of millions of dollars on GPUs and data centers and powering them, partly as a jobs program, partly going back to what we were talking about before. That's not an experimental budget for them. That's not like some Fortune 500 with a 6-person team where like some VP has a couple $1 million. This is a country that's trying to like have a geopolitical defense, right? This is sort of existential, and so you're not going to unwind that. Once you have a jobs program, it's really hard to unwind. So now you're like, okay, that money's not going away. But that starts to be a really interesting use case. You're like, well, how are they actually going to run those data centers? Like, do they know how to do that? Do they know how to orchestrate all those servers? Do they know how to actually like hire those people? Do they know? All of a sudden, like you now are starting to spin up a bunch of problems. You're like, well, could you actually, maybe that's the decentralized cloud? Like maybe it's not individuals running GPUs at home. Maybe it's a bunch of like mid-sized data centers all over the world that are sponsored by different governments that are not at 100% capacity. And like actually the decentralized cloud is like gluing all those people together because they don't know how to go get customers the way AWS does, right? I'm not saying that's going to happen necessarily. I think it's an interesting thought experiment. But the point is like you start with a particular user and you're like, wow, that's an interesting user. They have a real problem. They're spending a lot of money that's not going to unwind anytime soon. What problems do they have? And how do I go about solving those problems? That's kind of how I would think about it.
And with that, I think I would like to thank our panelists. Avichal, Chris, thank you both so much for being up here. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks, guys.